So this is probably going to be a very long video. Odds are I have put timestamps either in a pinned comment below or in the description box or in both. Feel free to skip ahead to sections that pique your fancy. We're not going to be doing the fun facts today, mostly because this is the third time I have shot this video.
The next chart shows the drop in the crime rate over the last month. I just erased everything.
The lesson to learn from that, y'all, is don't ever try to edit a video when you're bedridden with a fever and hopped up on NyQuil, and I should really just shut up with all of this exposition and get into the meat of this video. So hi, hello, my name is Prachi, I'm 25 years old. I embarked on a no-buy year that runs from February 5th, 2019 to February 5th, 2020, in which I'm not allowed to buy makeup, skincare, hair care, perfumes, candles, and books. If you'd like to know more about my precise rules and reasoning for going on a no-buy, I'm gonna link up in the cards my intro video. We're now a little over 7.5 months in, and so I wanted to sit down and just sort of share a couple of the things I've been reflecting on that I've learned over the course of my no-buy year. So here's the thing about my no-buy year. I very, very happily on February 5th, 2019 embarked on this no-buy year, and it caused my mental health to almost completely and totally collapse. Now I know you, dear viewer, may be watching this and you may think I'm exaggerating or drawing false conclusions or confusing correlation with causation, because surely something as insignificant as a shopping no-buy would not lead to a total collapse of my mental health. But hopefully by the end of this video, I will have successfully explained to you how exactly it was that simply doing the act of going on a no-buy where I wasn't allowed to buy makeup, skincare, hair care, perfume, candles, and books led to a complete sort of mental breakdown and, quite frankly, a much stronger rebuilding of my life. Shopping was, in my life, prior to my no-buy, a multifaceted, multifunctional thing. It fulfilled so many roles that I had no idea about until I actually ended up yanking shopping out of my life. It functioned as a reward, as a means of self-medication, as stress relief, as self-care, as escapism, and as my entire personality. There's gonna be a lot to unpack there. So, without any further ado, let's get it. One of the ways in which I used to use shopping was as a reward. This was one of the more innocuous roles that shopping occupied in my life. I think we're all accustomed to the idea of buying oneself something as a reward because we did something successfully. Maybe we got a new promotion at work, or we got an A on an exam, or a 4.0 in class. And because we want to reward ourselves, we go out and we buy a thing. And there's nothing really terribly or majorly wrong with that. However, I will say that the idea of shopping as a reward does start to become a little bit dangerous if you start using shopping to reward yourself for very, very benign things. For example, I do distinctly remember going through certain phases in my life where I was super depressed. And while attempting to claw myself out of my depression, I made a decision to start using shopping as a way to reward myself for doing very, very basic things. Things like getting out of bed, brushing my teeth, showering, attending class. And the thing is, if you're really depressed, this is actually a really great strategy for getting yourself functioning again. By which I mean that the strategy of rewarding yourself, maybe with encouraging self-talk or with engaging in an activity that you really like to do, that general strategy of rewarding yourself for having done small things, that's really good. The problem is, my choice of reward was shopping. And so every single time that I would just get through a day without, lying numbly in bed or wanting to die or whatever, I would end up rewarding myself by buying a thing. And I'm a lower middle class, relatively broke university student who is forced to take on a job while also studying in order to alleviate the pressure of student loans. I cannot afford to be using buying things as a daily reward to myself simply for not wanting to die. Using shopping as like my one and only valid reward, it ended up kind of setting a really dangerous precedent for me. One where the act of shopping was constantly only associated with positive feelings doing well and success. Because basically, if every time I do something well or successfully, I end up buying something, then suddenly buying things becomes associated with success and with doing well. We're gonna put a pin in this idea for now and move on to the second role that shopping really played in my life prior to my no-buy year. And this is shopping in its function as self-medication. So I've already touched briefly on how I used shopping as a way to sort of medicate or get out of or cope with depression. But I also do want to take a brief aside here to mention that I'm a person who has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. And here's the deal with ADHD. It's basically a shortage of one particular chemical in your brain, dopamine. The thing about dopamine is it's a very, very important chemical for your brain. Dopamine is a key building block chemical in your ability to successfully adult, your ability to not give in to your worst impulses, to stave off instant gratification, and to properly organize and plan for your future and to achieve your goals. All of that is possible because of dopamine in your brain. And if you have ADHD, you don't have enough of it in your brain. Miss Dopamine, she's not home. Now, if you're properly diagnosed with ADHD, you get on medications, and those medications will help release stimulants into your brain. However, I was a person who didn't know that I had ADHD until I was 24 years old. I went well over a decade of my life having ADHD without knowing that I had it, without even really knowing that there was anything wrong with me. And here's the thing about our brains. They're smart little stinkers. If you have ADHD, aka your brain doesn't have a lot of dopamine, your brain will begin trying to engage in activities that release dopamine. Prescription stimulant medications aren't the only way to release dopamine in your brains. You know what else is Miss Dopamine's best friend? Shopping. You know the experience of either going online on Sephora or some other website, or maybe walking physically into a store, and you're almost a little bit on the prowl. You're browsing all of the different pages online, or walking through the aisles at that Sephora. You're swatching things, you're touching things, you're looking at a bunch of different items, you're gauging which ones you think will work best. And then finally, you pick one and you buy it and it's yours. That rush that you sort of get, that's dopamine being released by your brain. And if you do online shopping, it's actually a double whammy, because you get that burst of dopamine when you place that order, and then a second burst of dopamine when that package arrives for you in the mail and you open it. And so my personal form of self-medication, the way in which I medicated my ADHD for years, before I knew I had ADHD, before I got properly diagnosed, before I got on the proper medications, was through shopping. I would all the time, couple times a week, buy some tiny little thing, some small piece of makeup from the drugstore, or a piece of skincare, or maybe it would be a used book from the used bookstore, or some like hairspray or something. I would constantly be picking up little items like this because on days when I went shopping, I genuinely felt better, right? I would get that little dopamine hit, which would boost my mood. I would feel really happy and excited. But because I have ADHD, I would also feel more focused and energized and motivated and organized purely through the act of shopping. But again, I would like to remind you, I'm a broke-ass student. The act of constantly going shopping, spending $5, $10 here, $5, $10 there, multiple times a week, it leaches my own future financial security. Remember what I said about dopamine being one of the things that helps you properly plan for the future? Because it helps you delay gratification, it helps you remember the bigger picture, like, oh, your savings and retirement and your future life goals. I was not doing any of that. My dopamine was out to lunch. Every single time I would go and spend a little bit of my money to buy a thing to medicate myself, I was masking the ADHD, and I was digging a financial hole for myself. Because even though I never went into credit card debt in order to buy things, like I have always paid my credit card off entirely on time, I have student loans. And I'm literally currently working a job in order to alleviate and offset my student loans. And yet I would use the vast majority of my income for my job not to pay back some of my student loans or accept less money so that I would have less debt later. I was using the vast majority of the money that I made from my job to pay for my cell phone bill, a couple of transit costs, and then to buy a bunch of shit. Specifically, a bunch of beauty shit. Creams and potions and sparkly little things to put on my skin. And here I'd like to transition from this particular role that shopping played onto a much larger, pernicious, and messy role that shopping played in my life. Those of you who've been watching my channel for a while now, you guys will know that I started my no-buy year in February. My February check-in was fine. My March check-in was an absolute mess because after simply 1 month of being on my no-buy, I fell down a terrible, horrible, and horrifying spell of depression. And in my March check-in, which I'm gonna link in the cards, I very briefly mentioned a realization that I had, which is that I had 2 ways of relieving stress and coping with life. The first was shopping, and the second was food. And although I clocked this in my March check-in, like literally just like 2 months into my no-buy, sitting now in September 2019, I have come to realize that they were not just my primary ways of dealing with stress or taking care of myself, they were the only way I had to deal with stress. And in fact, while I was able to use food to relieve stress quite frequently, I was never able to justify properly for myself eating food as a part of self-care. You know what I was able to justify as self-care though? Shopping. And in fact, for years now, I have known no form of self-care other than shopping. Shopping was all I had. It was the only way I knew to take care of myself. And here I want to take the pin out from point number 1, which is my use of shopping as a reward. I had been so used to using shopping as a reward for myself. And linked to point number 2, I had also been using shopping to self-medicate. Every single time I would shop, my brain would release the dopamine that it so needed in order to just function. And so for years and years and years of my life, the only association that I had with shopping was a good one. And the end result of that is that shopping was one of the few things in my life which felt comfortable and which felt good. I would push myself during times of stress, during times when I was like not feeling great, to shop in an effort to try and recapture that sense of well-being and success and organization and togetherness that I had felt previously every single time that I had shopped. And I think for sure there is definitely a video here to be made about capitalism and how it has scammed us into believing that self-care is a thing which can be bought. Actual, genuine self-care, the self-care that therapists talk about, that requires time. And in that sense, actual self-care is a luxury. You pit it up against the horrible socioeconomic reality of most of our lives, which is that we work terrible jobs for minimum pay, and we can't afford to cut down on our hours, and there's no such thing as actually taking time off. We can't afford to take time off, either because it would mean we get fired, or because it would mean a reduction of hours and pay, and our cost of living is too high compared to what we're actually making. And so real, genuine self-care, sleeping 8 hours a night, not overworking yourself, being able to take time off from work, being able to only work for like 40 to 50 hours every week, 5 days a week, that's almost an impossibility for the vast majority of us. And so instead, we listen to capitalism when it tries to then sell us self-care, when it tells us that self-care can be found in buying fancy candles and pretty sheet masks and that lipstick that you want because you deserve it. You work so hard. Why don't you reward yourself, take care of yourself by buying that beautiful little trinket that you want? And I fell hard for that messaging. I way overworked myself. I way overbooked myself. I did not make any time in my life for actual self-care. I had no knowledge of what actual self-care is, because the word self-care is bandied around by companies so frequently and loosely nowadays that people truly think self-care is associated with buying stuff. That you need to somehow buy a bunch of stuff in order to be able to take care of yourself. If we like set aside what it is I said about time being a luxury that like not a lot of us can afford, and we just hone in on like the actual activities that make up real, true self-care, not one of them costs a damn thing. The best way I can possibly describe self-care is, how would you take care of yourself if you were a 5-year-old child? I don't know about y'all, but if I, for example, were taking care of a 5-year-old girl, I would make sure she slept at least 7 to 8 hours every single night and had a decent bedtime. I would make sure she brushed her teeth every morning and every night. I would make sure she went outside every day and played a little bit. I would make sure she was eating at least 3 meals a day. I would make sure she has a clean room to be in. I would make sure she goes see the dentist every 6 months and that she goes to the doctor for her checkups. I would be nice to her. When she was feeling stressed or upset, I would sit down with her and talk to her about her feelings. And all of that stuff that you would do to take care of like a 5-year-old child, that stuff is self-care. And the vast majority of that stuff doesn't cost a thing. And you'll notice none of that stuff is stuff to buy. My own definition of self-care was so warped that I thought it consisted of buying things. It was the only way that I knew how to feel better. And the problem is, buying things momentarily feels really, really good, but it doesn't solve any of my fucking problems. And I had a lot of problems. And so here I would like to transition to the next role that shopping played in my life. I used shopping as escapism because I'm a person with a lot of problems. I'm a woman of color, I'm an immigrant, I'm decidedly lower class, I'm pretty poor. Whatever financial stability I've had, it's been very recent. And I'm not straight. And I come from a culture, because I'm South Asian, where who I am functionally as a person is just wrong. I'm a woman, and that's wrong. I'm not heterosexual, and that's wrong. I have ADHD, and I've also suffered from depression and anxiety as a side effect of having ADHD and it being undiagnosed for so long, and having any sort of a mental illness, both in Western society, but definitely in the East where I'm from. Like, that's very wrong and bad. And that's like just the cultural aspect. Then let's talk about the fact that like I have an actual mental illness, which means like life is harder for me than it is for a neurotypical person. Like, it just is. I graduated high school in 2012. I got into university in 2012. It is the year 2019. I hope to graduate in May 2020, which means it will have taken me 8 years, twice as long, to get an undergraduate degree, even though I'm a person who has an above average IQ. And so theoretically, university should have been a breeze for me, but I have a mental illness, and it was undiagnosed for a really long time, and there was a huge amount of fallout from that, and it made my life really difficult because it's literally a disability, right? So my life is hard. There are aspects of it that are really difficult. And that's not to say like, oh, I'm like the worst person in the world or whatever, because it's like, listen, I come from fucking South Asia. I am acutely aware of what my life could have been like and of how insanely privileged I am to be where I am right now. But that doesn't change the fact that my life was really hard. And moreover, it doesn't change the fact that the difficulties of my life and just the situation I am in and the very person that I am have led overwhelmingly to me feeling like I am not enough. I'm a woman, which means I'm not man enough. I'm a woman of color, which means I'm not white enough. I am not thin enough. I am not rich enough. I am not straight enough. I am not sane enough. I am just not enough, right? That is the overwhelming feeling which I have been battling with for like years of my life. This like deep-seated knowledge that I am not enough. And in an effort to feel like I am enough, I have done two things. So firstly, I have made, and this is really the final biggest role that shopping played in my life, I made shopping a part of my personality, or it became my personality, which is to say that because I felt like I was not enough, I would go out and buy things. Because if I had enough, maybe I would be enough. You know, like, sure, I'm not thin enough, pretty enough, rich enough, whatever, but if I have the right amount of stuff, the right combination of it, perhaps it will be enough to make me enough for this world. I thought I could buy a personality. I thought I could buy self-worth. Okay, we're back, bitches. Sorry, I just called you bitches. Anyway, I've composed myself, and I basically had an idea of the person who I wanted to be, a person who I thought was enough. And that person was thinner than me, prettier than me, more accomplished than me, much smarter than me, much more successful. She was like some sort of a lawyer. She got into like a pretty decent law school, graduated really well. Maybe she worked for the United Nations, maybe she worked for the ICC, maybe she worked for an international corporation or like a really big legal consulting firm solving problems, because that's the thing I've always liked doing. I love puzzles, I love problem solving. Either way, she was a woman who was satisfied with her career, satisfied with her life, high-powered, traveled a lot. She was enough. In my eyes, she was enough. That fantasy version of myself. She dressed a certain way and styled herself a certain way, and she lived a certain lifestyle. And the thing is, that fantasy version of myself, she's not necessarily unattainable, right? Definitely the perfect way in which I was envisioning her life is unattainable, because perfection is unattainable, but the idea that I will get into a law school that I like, that I will end up in a job where I feel like I'm intellectually stimulated, where I'm helping to solve problems, whether they're problems on like a global scale or whether they're problems on a much more individualistic scale. My capacity to do all of that, to have that as part of my future self, that's not like unattainable. However, buying the Jo Malone perfume that financially stable future lawyer me would use is not the way to become financially stable future lawyer me who is happy with her life. Abstractly and intellectually, I knew that, and I think we all know that we can't like buy our way into the versions of ourselves that we want. But it's hard admitting that, and it's really hard to not engage in that behavior and to instead engage in the very difficult behaviors that would actually get me there, which for me, given my ADHD, I need to get the mess that is my health properly handled so that then my schooling, my learning, my academic capabilities, and my intelligence all have a stable foundation on which to stand and from which to grow. And instead of doing any and all of that, I tried to buy my way to health, prosperity, and genuine happiness. And here I want to go back to a thread I had pulled earlier, because at the start of this particular line of discussion, I said that I didn't think that who I was enough, and that one of the ways in which I tried to be enough was by buying things, right? By shopping. The second way in which I tried to be enough was by doing a lot of stuff. So I'm a person who I have a really hard time saying no when somebody asks me to do something, because what happens is it's like I feel like I am not enough. And then to compensate for that, I buy a bunch of shit so that I have enough, and then I overcommit and do a whole bunch of stuff so that I feel like I am doing enough. And the hope, the twisted hope inside of my head is that if I have enough stuff and that I'm doing enough things, somehow magically and miraculously I will be enough. And so even after I got diagnosed with ADHD, even after I began going on medications last year, the overwhelming feeling that I had was no excuses. You are 100% fixed, 100% fine. You better say yes to every single opportunity and obligation that comes your way. You better do all of the things that anyone ever suggests that you do. And so over the last year, I committed myself to like 6 or 7 different obligations, including full-time school, full-time work, law school applications, writing the LSAT, being the editor-in-chief of a journal, being the communications team lead on an anemia project, being a grant writer for an organization. It was insanity. I kept adding different obligations and layers onto my life to the point where I was so stressed out. And here's where all the previous pieces begin to come together, because what basically happened is over the past year, prior to my no-buy year, I committed myself to a whole bunch of different obligations so that suddenly I was doing a whole bunch of activities. And because a couple of those activities were actually paying me decently well, I had all of this extra cash and no real extra time. So then I was spending all of this extra cash instead of like saving it so I could pay down my student loans faster in the future. I was just spending it willy-nilly wholesale on makeup, skincare, hair care, books that I would never read because I didn't have the time to actually read. So they were like wish fulfillment books. I was buying perfumes. I was buying like everything from like drugstore things to like luxury items. I went insane shopping in 2018, and I went insane with the obligations that I took on in 2018. And then when it all came to a head, and then in February 2019, I made the decision to suddenly go on this no-buy, what I did is I yanked away shopping from myself. And what that meant was, previously I had been relying on the combination of activities and shopping to make myself feel like I was enough, right? I have to have enough and I have to do enough in order to feel like I am enough. And now that I had eliminated shopping, suddenly I no longer could use things to feel like I had enough. And so I way overcompensated with activities. And literally since the start of my no-buy year, since February 5th, 2019, I have increasingly just taken on more and more and more commitments because I haven't been shopping. This YouTube channel is literally one of them. The commitment I make to you as a viewer, to you as a subscriber, that's an added commitment that I took on because I felt like I was not doing enough. Because suddenly I could no longer use shopping to build up my self-worth. I had to way ramp up all of the activities that I was participating in, all of the work that I was doing, how productive I was as a human being in order to feel like I was worth something and that I was enough. And it got to the point where for months and months and months at a time, I was barely sleeping. I was not taking care of my health at all. I wasn't exercising, I wasn't eating properly. There was always some sort of deadline. There was always some sort of obligation. There was always at least 1 or 2 parts of my life that were on fire. And so not only was my life being really difficult, and not only were all of the problems that I have experienced over the years rearing their ugly heads full force, I had removed shopping, which was my only coping mechanism, my only form of stress relief, my only form of escapism from my life. Because the reality is that parts of my life have been on fire for a very, very long time. And I've always averted my eyes, looked away from the flames, and run to the nearest Sephora for refuge. I have always, even before my no-buy year, even before I was diagnosed with the ADHD, I have always overworked myself because I felt like I'm not doing enough to be worth something. I never let myself acknowledge the fact that all of the racism, misogyny, and homophobia that I deal with affects me. I don't allow myself the space to be disturbed by it. I never give myself the room to be upset or to cry or to grieve or to just deal, even when I'm alone. I didn't place value on my health, physical or mental, because I don't place any value on myself. I didn't even let myself admit that my mental illness was an actual illness that has an effect on my life. on my brain chemistry, on my mood, on my productivity, my academics, my physical health. My ADHD is a very real illness that affects all of these areas of my life in very real ways that need to be accounted for, and I never let myself do that. All of the stress, all of the fallout from my mental illness, all of that, the only way I knew how to cope, the only way I knew how to take care of myself was by shopping. Because not only did shopping make me feel good, it was a way for me to avoid looking at all of that bad. I didn't know and had never learned any other way to cope. And going on my no-buy, my sustained year-long no-buy, where I was suddenly not allowed to go shopping at all, it meant that I had to finally face the music, right? I pulled the rug out from underneath myself, and of course I fell. It wasn't like the no-buy caused my mental health to collapse. It was more that my mental health had always been a very fragile house of cards, barely held together by terrible coping mechanisms like overeating and shopping. And once I removed those toxic forms of coping from my life, I was able to finally and fully see the mess underneath. The parts of my life that have always been like a gigantic dumpster fire are finally exposed for me to see. Slowly but surely, over the last couple of months, the no-buy has forced me to actually look at the fire. I can no longer avert my eyes and just escape to Sephora. I have been forced to see. There has been a reckoning. And the thing about that reckoning is that it wasn't pretty. If you look at my March check-in, it wasn't pretty. If you look at the multi-week hiatus I took in June, and then the contents of my June check-in where I am so burnt out and exhausted and on the verge of tears, like that shit sucked, bro. Like, I'm not going to lie to you. Like, I had some of the worst months of my life. There was like a full-blown mental breakdown at some point during my no-buy year, and I know it was directly linked to my no-buy year because what I'd done is removed all of the unhealthy coping mechanisms out of my life, and so the shit was just collapsing, like first scene in fucking Inception where the buildings and walls are all closing in. Like, it was not pretty, it was not fun, I was not having the time of my life, but I would not exchange it for anything. Because I am so much more proud of the person that I am sitting right here on the floor of my apartment in September 2019 than the person that I was in February 2019. I can say wholeheartedly that I'm actually facing the issues in my life head on. I am working on them. That is what I mean by the reckoning, because the no-buy has forced me to reckon with what is real and important in my life. Previously, I was only ever reckoning with surface level issues because the shopping masked everything else. Now I'm doing the hard work of reckoning with what matters. Listen, like, we are still firmly in the middle of reckoning. Like, a bitch is still attending therapy and fucking up on the daily, honestly. But, and I think this is really important to note, I feel like I am enough now. Just as I am. You know, like, even without the newest, shiniest palette, even without the Cover FX blush that I so want, even without the flawless skin, like, I am enough. I am enough. And that doesn't mean I don't want more for myself or more for my life. But instead of building towards that more from a space of like hollowness and emptiness and not being enough, I am building towards that more from a foundation of I am enough just as I am now. But guess what? Badassery has no bounds and we can keep going. And that feeling is something that, like, nothing I've ever bought has ever actually achieved for me, right? Even my most beautiful, expensive, luxurious, and favorite makeup has never given me that feeling. All of the tomfoolery and the mental breakdowns and everything that happened as a result of not shopping, and the fact that I forced myself to go to therapy, that's what has given me that. I'm not perfect. Still definitely have days where I'm like, I'm a trash human being and worth nothing and I just want to buy something to make myself feel better. Like, listen, like, that's not, I don't think, ever really gonna go away, but I'm able to like talk myself down from that. And I have more good days than I do bad now. And that's something, folks. This video is so long. My battery has died. I recharged it for like a little spurt, so I'm just gonna wrap this up before it dies again. Thank you so much for watching this like long, winding, philosophical, emotional video. As always, I hope you have a great upcoming week. And even if the rest of your week ends up becoming messy or imperfect, I hope that you're still able to create and experience some truly beautiful moments. Bye!